Okay, far away.
Yeah. So I heard that in response to the Rambam, the Vilna talked about how philosophy led him astray, at least in regards to the turning demons. And I was wondering, what would motivate the Vilna Gaon to say this, and is there any truth in him saying this, that philosophy led the Rambam?
Oh my gosh, you have to get used to the layers here, and I'm going to comment on whether there's any truth to what the Vilna Gaon said. That's like asking me, did Einstein get it right or didn't he get it right? Who you're asking. His words are philosophia ha'arura hit ato. The cursed philosophy led him astray, or deceived him. Now, I think you have to understand what he meant and what the truth is, both of which are the same. The Rambam never relied on Aristotle for anything. He never ever said, I accept this as true because Aristotle said so. Indeed, throughout his works, he quotes Aristotle, and he sometimes agrees and sometimes disagrees. And sometimes he disagrees with the commentators of what Aristotle meant. The Rambam is an entirely independent thinker. The Rambam recognizes only three sources, legitimate, authoritative sources of truth. One is abstract reasoning, and one is sense perception, and one is the Torah. There is no other source of authority or credibility whatsoever. So when he quotes Aristotle, it means he himself analyzed what Aristotle said, and he agrees. And that's why he's free to disagree, and he disagrees often. Now, that means the Rambam was not consciously following the authority of anything other than those three sources that I told you. Still, people can be unconsciously affected by what they investigate. And the Gaon of Vilna was saying that Rambam was affected by the philosophy that he learned, not that he had any conscious adherence to it, but that he was affected by it. Anybody can be affected. Everyone is fallible. Anybody could say could be affected by any subject. Of course, you have to be very big to say that about someone like the Rambam. The Vilna Gaon was very big. Some people have the misimpression that there are thresholds in Jewish history, and anyone after the threshold cannot criticize someone before the threshold. That's simply not true. It's simply not true. The only thing that cannot be criticized is a statement in the Talmud that a legal decision has been arrived at. But beyond that, everything is fair game. The sages of the Talmud disagree with the Mishnah, and Achronim, those of the last 500 years, do disagree with Rishonim. I'm learning Maharalim in a certain sefer, and he quotes Rashi. He said, "You shouldn't have said that." I have a Shagas Arya who disagrees with the Tosfos. The Vilna Gaon disagrees with Rishonim often. So there's nothing outlandish about it, and he feels that here the Rambam is disagreeing with open Gemaras. Now, of course, the Rambam disagrees with open Gemaras. It's because he believes other open Gemaras support him against these open Gemaras. That happens all the time in Psak, as well as other subjects. And the Vilna Gaon says he disagrees with his analysis, disagrees with his relative priorities, and he thinks that he was misled by the fact that he interacted with philosophy. The Vilna Gaon was very great. The Rambam was also very great. Like I said, the manuscript that I was reading to you, there was a disagreement between Rashi and the Ramban. It's not given to us to show that either one of them is incorrect. And therefore we have to deal with both of them as realities and try to jockey our way through the sources and without disrespecting either of them. It's not up to us, it's not given to us to show that either the Vilna Gaon or the Rambam was incorrect. But we're living with the fact that there were two views, and two very great people took those views, and we live with both of them, that's all. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
So, is there any obligation then for, I guess, veganism under the Torah? So in other words, now, especially at least 200, 300 years ago, when it wasn't possible to consume purely a plant-based diet without, let's say, killing animals. But now, let's just to assume, let's say, you're able to live a plant-based diet or a diet that doesn't rely on killing animals, would you then have an obligation then to not kill animals?
Certainly not. I don't know where how is coming from. Jews should have an obligation not to kill animals because we can get adequate nutrition from plant sources. Where is there an obligation not to kill animals in the first place?
Don't you have an obligation not to cause unnecessary suffering to animals?
Well, first of all, unnecessary includes the fact that we have the right to use them for our purposes. That would be called necessary, not unnecessary. And the mode of slaughter is very, very largely painless. So it's just not serious to talk about unnecessary suffering. But killing is one thing, and unnecessary suffering is something else. There are two separate prohibitions. That's not where you started from. There's no Let me just put just a tiny bit of background. Until the time of Noach, there was some restriction or other against using animals. Now, there's a difference of opinion what the restriction was. There are those who say that people were not allowed to eat meat until after the flood. And then that permission was given. That's explicit in the verses. Others say we were allowed to eat meat, we just weren't allowed to kill animals for meat. But once the animal died, we could eat it. And indeed, there's a midrash that says angels made barbecue for Adam and Chava in the Garden of Eden. And they weren't barbecuing salmon. They were barbecuing meat. So the question of whether they were even vegetarians, let alone vegans. And vegans are as strict as we are. They're worried about blias, worried about tarovas. They might as well write their own Shulchan Aruch. There's no reason, if Adam and Chava ate meat, then there's certainly no problem with eating meat going all the way back. And Noach was given permission to kill animals for meat. That's for sure. Others say that they didn't eat meat and they started to eat meat, but everyone agrees that Noach was given permission to eat animals and to kill animals for food. There's no problem whatsoever in killing animals for food.
Would you say that killing animals causes harm to animals?
I'm sorry, say again?
Would you say that killing animals causes harm to animals? In a humane way, let's say, a humane slaughter would still cause harm to an animal?
There's no prohibition against causing harm to an animal. The prohibition is causing, as you said it, and now you've left out the crucial word, yes, unnecessary harm. And necessity means they are allowed to be used for work. If the horse would rather roam free rather than carry riders from place to place, too bad.
Even if there's another way of achieving the same end, it would be seen as unnecessary?
No.
In the case I'm proposing, I'm saying if there is another way to receive, let's say, nutrition or sustenance, then instead of going through that way, you go through the way of consuming animals, and on that added fact, let's say...
No, I don't see why that's so. Pain is one thing, and slaughtering is something else. There's no prohibition whatsoever against slaughtering, not even lechatchila, not even if you could do it the same thing the other way. There's no such prohibition at all.
You're saying it's about pain, then. That seems to be...
That's right. You don't cause unnecessary pain to animals. But slaughtering, everybody who talks about this has never seen it, never been present when it happened, and he's using his imagination and poetry to inform his very scholarly ideas about the subject. But I've seen shechting birds many times, but I saw a film of slaughtering animals and cows. And one way in which it's done is you hoist the animal upside down, hanging from one leg and a chain, and then its throat is very exposed, and you slaughter it that way. When you hoist the animal up, the animal is totally passive. Doesn't struggle, doesn't yell, it just hangs upside down. The normal procedure, which isn't that, which is placing the animal on the ground or restraining the animal, there is a professor in some university in Texas. Her name is Temple Grand. She happens to be a person with autism, and she's a university professor, and her expertise is animal behavior, animal care. And she was invited by a Jewish slaughtering agency to investigate it, to observe it, and to give her judgment as to whether it's humane or not. And she said it is. And she's not Jewish. So, when people tell you how terrible it is, everything else, let them go fight with a professor in Texas. You can look it up. You can look it up on the net. So, the idea there, and then eating meat, if the temple were standing, it would certainly be impossible to be a vegan or a vegetarian. Of course, there you have to offer sacrifices. And some of the sacrifices you have to eat. And the Kohanim ate many sacrifices all the time. But you're going to be holier than the priests because you're not going to eat meat? I mean, it's, from a Jewish philosophical point of view, it's absurd. It's absolute nonsense. So, the final thing is, why was there a change at the time of Noah? So one explanation is that part of the criminal activity of the generation of the flood was behaving in an animalistic way, especially vis-a-vis sexual matters. And if you're tempted, now of course what I'm going to say to you now is utterly foreign, utterly wild. If you're tempted to think of a human being as just another animal, no one would do that, would they? Just another animal, and on par with other animals, and having same origin other animals, human unexceptionalism, may have heard of that? No one would think that. But then if that's so, you give yourself permission to act like an animal. If you really are just another kind of animal, then why shouldn't you act like an animal? Who can say you nay? So we were told, you're going to be able to slaughter animals for food, then you aren't just another kind of animal. You can't slaughter people for food, and you can't slaughter cows for food. Then you're not just a super cow. You're something else. And that to be driven home to the person, and he hasn't got license to behave like an animal. Of course, animals are used for our purposes, even to the point of killing them. Yeah. Yes.
When we say that God loves Bnei Israel in general, is that just an expression, or
Is that what?
Is that just the way he interacts with the world, or is that a comment on his true essence?
Not quite sure I'm getting all your words because you're not speaking American. You're speaking some foreign language that's pronounced in a different way. But the official view, I think, of all the deep sources, including the philosophical sources and the Kabbalistic sources, is that talking about God in any anthropomorphic way is not literally true, and certainly includes emotions. God doesn't get angry, and God doesn't love, and God is in pain, and so forth and so on. Nevertheless, these emotional descriptions are a description of how he interacts with the world. Now, I don't know where I heard this. I heard this very recently, maybe just a couple of months ago. It comes out that emotions are a way of defining classes of actions. And it might be that without the emotions, you would not be able to define that class of actions. So, the picture that we have from all the sources is that a human being has two levels. There's his character, motivation, will, on the one hand, and there's action on the other hand. And there are certain words that are used double for a type of action and also for character, motivation. Let's take cruelty. There are cruel actions, and then there are cruel people and cruel character. So the word functions doubly to describe the external observable action and the internal character of the person. Now, for Kodesh Baruch Hu, there is no internal character, no internal motivations. We don't talk about God's internal life at all. There's just a word for the actions. But the way we describe them is, these are the kinds of actions that he would do if he were angry. He isn't really angry, but they're the kind of actions that he would do if he were angry. Now, the thought that I got a couple of months ago was, how would you describe the set of actions if you didn't have the word for the character trait and the motivation behind the actions? What would pull all the actions together? What would give them a commonality? We could say that cruel actions are the kind of actions that cruel people with cruel motivation do. If you didn't have the concept of cruelty as a character trait, doesn't sound like there would be something else that you could use to rope together all those actions. So it comes out that emotions and emotional terminology become a cognitive tool. This is somewhat similar to Thomas Damasio's work against Descartes, Descartes' Mistake, and other books that he wrote, where the emotions play a role in cognition. But here it's very basic. I'm not sure this is right, but it's on the same level. The bottom line is, yes, we don't speak of God as literally having these emotions. We talk about him behaving in a way that people who have the emotions would behave.
It almost be a one-way love. We'd be loving God.
Well, I mean, to say that whatever God is behind it isn't what we call LOVE doesn't mean it's zero. It's not one way. It's just that one direction is something we can describe in terms we understand. The other direction is something we can't describe. Doesn't mean there isn't another direction. Doesn't make it a one-way reality.
When Moshiach comes, will there be any halachas that we follow now that will change on the basis that those halachas are wrong, that we're following incorrect halachas?
There is a tradition, I think it goes back to the Arizal, that in those times we'll follow the halachas of Beis Shammai as opposed to Beis Hillel. But you have to be very, very careful when you talk about ones that are wrong. There's a tractate in the Talmud called Horius, which talks about how the Sanhedrin functions. And one of the things it discusses is what happens when the Sanhedrin changes its mind. And the situation is fairly subtle. Let's say someone goes to the Sanhedrin and asks a question about Shabbos observance. There's such and such an action permissible on Shabbos. In particular, does it violate any of the 39 biblical malachos? And they say, no, it does not. It's permissible. So he does it. 10 years later, the Sanhedrin reconsiders the situation. By the way, by that time, the composition of the Sanhedrin will typically have changed considerably because the members of the Sanhedrin are usually elderly people. And so they're replaced quite regularly. And the Sanhedrin reconsiders and says, yes, it is. That action does violate one of the malachos. Okay, so now, usually, when someone violates and performs a malacha on Shabbos, and he did so not intentionally, he brings a korban chatas. Well, but this fellow who asked the Sanhedrin the first time, it's not just that he was ignorant, he didn't look it up. He did the best as you can. He went to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin said that it's permissible. To think of him as an ordinary shogeg, which would require a korban chatas, is not easy because shogeg usually requires some measure of negligence. It's not just that you're ignorant. There are times when you're ignorant of the truth and you do something that's wrong, and you don't bring a chatas because you have the responsibility to know the truth. Now, what should he have done? Been smarter than the whole Sanhedrin? To know the truth better than they? Can you hold a person responsible for that? It's very hard. Well, the first Mishnah in Horus discusses this issue, and we paskin the halacha not like the Mishnah, we paskin against the Mishnah, that the individual does have to bring a chatas. After the second ruling Sanhedrin is publicized, he has to bring a chatas. Now that says two or three very important things that have to be thought about. I can't work them to the bottom, but I at least acquaint you to what's going on. When, for example, you have a Supreme Court decision in the United States, I think the rule is that it's only forward. It's not ex post facto. Even legislation to be ex post facto is very difficult, but a Supreme Court ruling cannot change a decision that was given in the past. It can only say from now on, we'll do it differently. When you have a decision of a body like that, or lahavdil like the Sanhedrin, how do you look at it? Do you look at it that they are creating the law? their decision gives the law its validity? Or do you look at it that they're somehow trying to discern a reality that's external to them, about which they could make a mistake? One of the nafkaminas, one of the differences, whether it's ex post facto or not. If you have, like the Supreme Court of the United States, where each decision takes effect from then on, that's quasi-legislative. Because they decided it, that is now the law. Before that, it wasn't the law. You cannot penalize someone in 2013 for something he did in 2010 if the Supreme Court only ruled that it was forbidden in 2013. Because before the Supreme Court ruled in 2013, it wasn't forbidden. It really wasn't forbidden, because the whole legal authority in the United States said it was forbidden. And now the Supreme Court has decided that it is forbidden. We do have ex post facto. A person in 2010 goes to the Sanhedrin and asks him what about Shabbos. They say it's permissible. 2011 he does it. 2013 they change their mind. He has to bring a sacrifice for what he did in 2011. So that implies that they're not creating law. They're trying to discern some correct law, and the second Sanhedrin is saying that the first Sanhedrin made a mistake. Not just ruling differently, it's saying they make a mistake. That's why it has ex post facto application. So now, what shall we say about the person who, in the interim, did the action? Did he do the right thing or the wrong thing? Was he correct or incorrect? Was he praiseworthy or worthy of condemnation? What exactly should we say about him? It's not a simple case. Because on the one hand, he asked the Sanhedrin, he's certainly not guilty of rebellion. Hard to even see that he was acted irresponsible in any way. On the other hand, he did something that was objectively wrong. And he's since it was objectively wrong, he has to make some kind of tikkun, some kind of reparation for the fact that he did something that's objectively wrong. So you have to distinguish between having full legal authority for doing what you're doing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, what you're doing is in accord with what the abstract absolute law is. And those are two different considerations altogether. Now, let's get back to your question.
So when Moshiach comes, will the law actually change?
So now, if the law will change, and it's on the basis of the fact that the Sanhedrin will vote differently, which I think is the way we understand that, it will mean that all of what we did throughout all the generations until the Moshiach came, we had full legal authority to do. We're not condemned into being irresponsible in any way or guilty in any way. On the other hand, that later Sanhedrin will say that the halacha really is like Beis Shammai, it isn't really like Beis Hillel. And that being the case, we may have to make amends for the fact that was. Now, there's only one other thing which some people say. It's a little superficial, I think, and therefore it's hard for me to know how seriously to take it. But there is a statement in the Talmud, Shigas Talmud Ola Zodom. A person makes a mistake in learning, comes to a wrong conclusion, is counted as if he did it deliberately. That's challenging. I mean, people do things by accident. Maybe they're sloppy about it. So one thing to say is, well, shgaga means negligence. Maybe negligence in Torah study is more serious than other things, and therefore the penalties of deliberate transgression apply to it. Now, what happened here with the Sanhedrin? The second Sanhedrin is saying that the first Sanhedrin is making a mistake. Really? They made a mistake. A mistake in learning. Well, if we have the idea that making a mistake in learning is counted as if it were intentional, not that they were intentional, and not to be punished for it being intentional, but as if it were intentional in some sense, then maybe it's more serious than it looks on the surface. And then, Well, what about the individual who went and asked the Sanhedrin? Maybe the Sanhedrin, those 71 people, didn't exercise enough caution, enough objectivity, some failure in their deliberations, and maybe they stand responsible for the mistake. But what is this poor fellow from Tiberia wants to know whether he can, tie the knot on Shabbos? Why is he responsible? Now the Maharal says something very interesting. He says that the leadership of the Jewish people, on the one hand, and the nation that they lead, on the other hand, are bound together in a single integrated relationship. And where you see a failure on one end, it can be, in part, a result of failures on the other end. And in particular, he says, achdus, unity, when you see disunity among the leaders of the generation, that can often be attributed to the fact that the rest of the nation is disunified. And instead of saying that the disunity in the nation is a result of the disunity among the leaders, it works the other way around. Because the people are disunified, the leaders are disunified. Unity is something which, if it works, has to work from top to bottom. Where it comes apart, then unity is not expressed. And there are cases of disunity in the people which are completely unjustified, which could then be reflected above. I'll give you just one example, which has this example has other lessons as well. There's one of the sages in the Talmud, I forget who it was, said, I never go to a gathering at which I'm praised. I don't like to be praised, and I certainly don't like to hear praise, and I never go to a gathering where I'm praised. So someone said to him, but you did. You were at that gathering and they praised you. He said, no, making a mistake. They weren't praising me, they were praising themselves. Meaning, they have this gathering. Now, I appear and they say, you see how important we are? We're so important that even he came to the gathering. We're really great people. We're really important people because he came to honor us. So who are they praising? The greater I am, the greater honor they get from the fact that I came. Their whole motivation was to praise themselves, wasn't to praise me. That doesn't bother me. When they're using me as a tool, a phony tool to build themselves up, that doesn't bother me. Okay, now take that idea and apply it to discussions, debates, fights, wars. Whose Rosh Yeshiva is bigger than whose Rosh Yeshiva? Oh, my Rosh Yeshiva is much bigger. He knows more. He's smarter. He's a bigger masbid, and so on and so on. What's really going on? The Talmud is saying, I'm a better Talmud than you are because I'm the Talmud. I'm a greater scholar than you are. He's really praising himself. He's not praising the rabbi. He's praising the rabbi to build himself up. That's absolutely useless and pejorative disunity. To have competition between different groups and different leaders and different philosophies as a way of building yourself up to aggrandize your own status. That kind of division between people, groups of Jews, can then be reflected by the disunity at the top. It can work both ways. So we have to appreciate when we talk about what's right and what's wrong and what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. That disunity is something we suffer from. I'll just make one more remark. I think just one more. The Gemara says, "Kina sofrim tar b'chachma." Everybody knows that. Every yeshiva bacher knows that. Kina sofrim. Sofrim is a word for scholars. Kina means being very zealous in supporting your own position. It's not jealousy or envy. It means very zealous, aggressive expression and application of your own opinion. That means pounding the table and yelling and waving your hands and screaming. And then when people are that way about learning, so then, and the Gemara says, "Vohei b'sufa." In the end, they come to love one another. But that's the way in which you get Torah understood by, vigorous, competitive debate. Well, although that Gemara is quoted very often, they don't quote the Maharsha. Maharsha says the word sofrim is a word for scholars of second-rate scholars, not first-rate scholars. First-rate scholars are not called sofrim; they're called chachamim. And it says in Maharsha, the pasuk says, "Divrei chachamim benachas nishmoim." They are heard in calm, in pleasant conversation. And the Gemara says that the scholars in Eretz Israel were superior to the scholars in Babel because hayu nochin zeh lezeh b'halacha. They were calm and peaceful and pleasant to one another when they discussed halacha. So let it not be thought that the sources prize the yelling, the screaming, and the pounding. No, it can be useful. Can be useful if you're second rate. And so I tell you, when I was here in yeshiva, first time in 1964, 65, I'm very old. My mother, Shalom, who was a lawyer, came to visit me. And I took her to a place where she could observe the Beis Medrash. And then I came to join her, and she said, "Why do they hate each other so much?" That's what she said. She said, I didn't picture how it would look to her. So at first I was shocked, and I thought, oh yeah, if you look in there, you don't know what's going on. They are yelling and screaming, they're pounding the table, they're waving, and they're turning back. That's crazy, what are you talking about? How can you say something like that? Okay, doesn't look friendly. She doesn't know that they would die for one another. She doesn't know that. She doesn't see that. So this idea that there has to be that kind of competition, not the top view of how Torah should be studied. Yeah.
How do you suggest this would develop your ability to think critically, to think an idea through?
I'm not getting the words. How do you do?
Develop your ability to think an idea through critically. Just think critically, basically.
I think it's a matter of character and experience and what you like to do. I like to argue. I like to get to the bottom of things. One of the reasons that I became frum is because I was brought up a reform, and at a certain point I discovered that they lied to me and hid certain things from me. And that really made me very angry. Let me make up my mind. Give me the information, give me the sources, let me make up my mind. You have to hide it from me and lie to me? I could not respect that. Also, I was a philosopher before I knew what philosophy was. I don't like someone it's the same thing, setting limits. So if you're doing science, there's a scientific method. If you're doing mathematics, you have certain axioms. If you're doing sociology, you have certain statistical methods. These things are given to you and you apply them. I always ask, why? Why these, why not other ones? What for? Is it arbitrary? What's behind it? I don't want my inquiry to be stopped anywhere. That's the way I am temperamentally. So I think the ability to think critically, such as I have, is because temperamentally that's what I wanted to achieve. And this was the way I got to it. Other than that, I know that Spinoza wrote a book, Rules of Logic, and my mother, again, also thinking of me, saw Rules of Logic, he's working on logic, so okay, Spinoza's passé, and he was doing something specialized, but Aristotle said, there's no such thing as the logic of thinking. Each discipline has its own method, and they don't transfer from one to the other. So whatever discipline you go into, what you have to learn is the logic of that discipline. I was retarded in learning Gemara for about 5 years because I was trained in mathematics. Mathematics has one type of methodology, and Gemara has a very, very different type of methodology, much closer to theoretical, empirical science than it is to mathematics. I wasn't trained that way. It was hard for me to adjust. So looking for the way to think critically, there'll be different types of critical thinking in different realms. One of the really difficult things about Torah study is that it's an integrated system across many dimensions. it's very hard to predict what will be relevant. You read Tosfos, or you read the Ran, you read the Rambam, and you see things coming in from different angles where you never think they had a relationship one to another at all. And then they pull them together. It's a very challenging study in that respect. And this, when you have chavrusas who are different, it's very enriching. Because of my training, the architecture of argument is something which is very important to me. I'm always thinking, what's his premise and how's he getting from here to there? My other chavrusas don't do that as much as I do. And that's one thing I contribute to them. And then one chavrusa who got his PhD from MIT in some scientific field. And, when we're arguing about something, he says, look, here are the cases, and here's how they fit on the curve. I say, but why are they there? So, I don't know, but they fit the curve, I'm looking for explanations, and he's looking for fitting a curve so he can predict the next case. That's all. So I provide the stimulus for looking behind the facts to find the explanation. He provides a stimulus for looking at the structure of the facts so he can predict the next fact. And between the two of us, we get a much richer picture. The argumentation in Talmud has many different dimensions. It's good when you have a chavrus to pick somebody who is sharper in some dimensions than you are, you than he, so that you can contribute to each other more than you could have singly. You don't want to have a chavrus with your clone. With your clone. You don't want to have a chavrus with your clone. You want somebody who's different from you in a certain way. So I've been very blessed with that. Yeah.
So is the reverse to you think someone who wants to go into like mathematics, if they only do Gemara, would be more difficult to them? The methodology is different?
I think it would not be as difficult because scientific reasoning uses math. It uses mathematical reasoning. It's hard to escape mathematical reasoning. It's just that in Talmud, like it is the Havdil in theoretical empirical science, it's a tool of analysis among lots of other tools of analysis. But I was stuck like a Johnny One-Note on one thing, and only doing one thing, and all the rest of it was hidden, and the main goal of it was hidden to me. I was heard someone giving a shir in the Dorim, it happened to be. And he told me, Isa Chepz and Isa Gavra. I said, he was a mathematician. I said to him, how do you define those terms? He said, I don't. I just kept going. I said, what? What do you mean? You're using terms that you don't define? How do you do that? Mathematics, everything's defined up front. And I realized in theoretical science, the definitions of the key terms is the last thing that you get to after you've done all the analysis. Because you need to have these terms to explain all of the data, and you're going through pieces of data. Every time you see a piece of data, you change the definitions in order to be able to fit the new data. And the definition is the last thing you get to. Chezkas Abatim, Baba Basra, you have 30 daf of cases. No verses that are cited, just cases. And each case is presented and then analyzed with all the material you have available, and the next case is presented and you revise it. And every case comes up, you revise it again because it's a new piece of data and the old tools you had don't quite fit the new piece of data. That's the way the reasoning goes. There's nothing like that in mathematics. You never revise definitions. You never revise axioms. You just apply them.
I think you did philosophy of science as well, though.
No, my field is philosophy of mathematics. I read in philosophy of science because it's related and because I was interested in it, as I did in other areas. But my main field was philosophy of mathematics. Yeah.
Just when you come across a Gemara and then let's say you learn some of the Rishonim and then they'll leave off with the authoritative, we don't understand what's going on in the Sugya. Based on that, how would you then be able to use that Sugya to pass in halacha? Really, truly, you don't understand what's going on.
Well, who leave it as Zorachiyun? The Mefarshim leave it as Zorachiyun, or I leave it as Zorachiyun? Well, okay. So let's say, for example, the context is whether something's biblically forbidden or not. So if they leave it as a tzarechiyut, that means you have to treat it as a possibly, but not necessarily, biblical prohibition, and there are rules for that. It's a suffix. You deal with a suffix with certain rules to deal with a suffix.
It would be more, let's say, if we were dealing with what's considered a kinyan.
Let's say what?
If we're dealing with what's considered a kinyan, let's say, then
what sort of a?
What is considered a kinyan?
What's considered a kinyan? Okay,
I'm not sure about this case.
Okay, good. So then if somebody did that kinyan, so do another kinyan again, so as to make sure that you have it. Because you may need to know for sure that it is a kinyan. And if the nafkamina is a derabanan, then you say it's okay. Because there's something derabanan, with a kula, and you say, and you can't rely on it. There are rules to tell you what to do when you don't have a resolved situation. And that's what you do with those. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah, you should.
Oh yeah. Why does Hashem want the Jewish people to sacrifice animals in the Gaon or the Mikdash?
Why does Hashem want the Jewish people to sacrifice animals? First of all, it's not just the Jewish people. I mean, sacrifices go all the way back to Cain and Abel, right? Abel sacrificed animals. Noah sacrificed animals. There are several ideas expressed in the idea of sacrifice. One, I mentioned before, is the idea that these things exist to serve me. They're not on a par with me, they're not of equal concern with me. According to some, it's much more grand than that. Were there no people, nothing would have any value at all. No moral or spiritual value at all. And with this one person in the world, then everything has moral and spiritual value because of what he will do, what will happen to him. That's one thing. Another thing is that these things are gifts from Hashem, and the fact that they're gifts have to be recognized. And one way you do it, for example, is take the first fruits, the firstborn animal of the mother, and sacrifice it as if to say, I acknowledge that this came from you. It's an acknowledgement. I'm not giving it to him because he needs it. He doesn't need it. But I'm acknowledging it by returning it to its source. When it is a sacrifice due to a transgression, it's a little more dramatic. One of the things you do with the sacrifice is you put your hands on the animal and you lean on it. Let the animal bear your weight. No, it doesn't cause an ox pain to bear my 180 pounds of weight. But it's if to say, what's happening to him really should happen to me. It really should happen to me. I failed. I'm the one who's guilty. And of course, Baruch Hu, in his kindness to me, allows this to be in place of me. Where do you have the first time that an animal is offered in place of a person? You all know. What is the first time that an animal is offered in place of a person? Keres Yitzchak. Right? Isaac was supposed to be sacrificed. God called it off. Something had to be sacrificed. An altar was built to present a sacrifice to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. In this case, it wasn't Isaac. It was an animal. But something had to be given that. Then, according to Kabbalistic sources, this is the way that the Kadosh Baruch Hu enables us to play a role in bringing blessing into the world. By presenting something to him, that's the trigger for him to bring blessing into the world. The whole point of the interaction between us and Kadosh Baruch Hu is that we should recognize. We should recognize, appreciate, live with the realization that Kadosh Baruch Hu is creating the world, that we owe our existence to him, and all the rest. But now, the more that we recognize it, the more he invests in it, because his investment in it is connecting with our appreciation for it, which means he's building a relationship with us. The more we would ignore his role in it, the less he would be invested in providing it. So sacrifices do that job. They express our recognition and appreciation, and then they become the key. I mean, this is very superficial. There are much deeper things as well. But the key for sort of motivating his response of giving more to the world. Well, these are a few of the reasons why there's such a thing as sacrifice. But you have to understand that I see people who talk about this as kind of uphill battle, you know. It's really terrible to kill animals. So I need a really good reason, you know, to overcome the fact that it's terrible. From our point of view, it isn't terrible. It isn't terrible. The animal as such has no intrinsic value. And even the pain, according to our sources, the reason I shouldn't cause pain to an animal is that I shouldn't become a cruel person. Not because the pain of the animal is intrinsically bad, but I acquire bad character by causing pain. So it's not a question of the intrinsic evil of the animal suffering. It's just not true. I mean, it'd be a hard pill to swallow, especially if you've been too overly affected by professors at Princeton, Jewish ones from Australia. But it's just that's not our view. Yeah.
Is Aggadic material always authoritative on halacha and hashkafic issues, and if so, to what degree?
Is what, say again?
Aggadic.
Well, Aggadic is just as much part of the Masorah, part of the tradition, every part of the statement of the great scholars as anything else, but it typically isn't presented in the same way. Most of the time it's not debated, not discussed. Very rarely is there a decision made about it, so you have less definitive material. But there are times when it is definitively discussed. A couple of times in the Talmud where a vote is taken, and then it certainly is binding and authoritative. You also have cases where you'll have many different sages expressing ideas on certain subjects, and there's a clear majority for one side against the other side. I told you this about the Rambam in the 6,000 years, and also Yisirim Shel Ava, that one of the things he says is that the view of one sage, that the world somehow is going to come to an end. And he has many statements in verses and other statements in the Talmud which say the way he reads it, the opposite. He says, okay, that was his view, but he's outvoted by far, and therefore that's a halachic type of reasoning. A minority can be ignored in favor of the majority, so that's halachic reason to something which is clearly Aggadic. So Aggadic is not less authoritative than halacha. It's just that given the authority by actually having formal decisions. But for example, when the Gemara in the Eruvin asked, Noach l'adam shenivra o lo Noach, which means roughly pleasant, appropriate, valid, consistent, was it good for man to be created or not? As Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai disagreed about it for 2.5 years, and then Beis Hillel caved in and said, Beis Shammai is right. Lo Noach lo shenivra. So now, I think it's Rabbi Salanter who asked the question. It's an obvious question. At the end of the creation, it says, he saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. That's a verse in the Torah. Were Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai discussing whether the verse in the Torah is true or false? Is that the subject of the discussion? Probably not, right? So then they'll have to think again what they could possibly have meant. So Salanter explained this. I saw this from Rav Dessler. He explains as follows: there's such a thing as succeeding at life, and there's such a thing as failing at life. Can we see successful living? Can we see a person's life and say, yeah, this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu invested in him, this is what he did with it, and that's a success? Is it possible for us to see that Noach Lo? We know it's true because the Torah says so, but can we see that it's true? That is Noach Lo Adam Shenivra, that his creation is a success. Now, the Nafkamina says, Rabbi Salanter, is this: if we could see what a success looks like, then we could use that to motivate ourselves to improve. Aha! That's what success looks like, so I'm going to move in that direction. But if we can't see what success looks like, then the way we move forward is only by distancing ourselves from failure. We do have pictures of unambiguous failures, that's for sure. We have them all around us, and certainly historically we have them. So when they came to the conclusion that you can't see it, then the nafkamina is that when you think of improving, you think of the things where people have failed, and you distance yourself from those. But the subject matter was not whether, but even so, it's certainly not a halachic matter, it's a hashkafic matter. And I will say one more thing, because this is being recorded, maybe people will, there is a rumor, no, it's more than a rumor, someone who had a rabbinic reputation said that there's no such thing as a law in hashkafic matters. Those are things, a decision, a law, a binding, authoritative position, no such thing. And he based it on 3 quotations from the Rambam. If I remember correctly, 2 were from Perish Mishnayos and 1 was from the Sefer HaMitzvos, where he's discussing a certain issue. Now, these books are written in Arabic. So he says something like, things like this we don't decide, or we don't commit ourselves, or we don't vote on, or we don't establish, or something like that. And all 3 of them were not matters of what to do. And so therefore, he said, on the basis of these 3 Rambams, that the Rambam's position is, these are things that you don't decide. Well, first of all, they weren't what we would call philosophical issues. One was, if a Zar eats Truma, does he get Misa B'dei Shemayim or not? What's the punishment for that? Another, I think, is what happens to a Soto who has mitzvos and she drinks the water, what kind of effect will it have on her? Which is a matter of discussion among the Tanoim. There's a third one like that. So then you say, well, okay, but it wasn't practical. It wasn't a matter of what to do, and then we're going to lump together everything about what we and say there's no decision about that. Really? There are no mitzvahs of belief? Things to believe? No one? That you can believe whatever he wants, makes no difference? And if there are mitzvahs, they're not signed, and there couldn't be disagreements about what you have to believe, what you don't have to believe, what the consequences are. But of course there are. There's a famous machlekes whether if a person believes that God is physical, whether he's an apikoros or not. Rambam said yes, and Rabbi said no. That's a disagreement about what the consequences of false belief are. And it's a philosophical issue whether God has a body or doesn't have a body. So really, there's no room for discussion and decision about these kinds of matters, so that it's very hard to define exactly what's meant by saying there's no decision in philosophical or hashkafic matters. Okay, these are fringe problems. The key problem is that what this rabbi wrote is dead wrong. It's dead wrong, because in 2 out of the 3, the Rambam himself paskins in the Mishnah Torah. He actually decides them legally. So it couldn't be that his position is these things can't be or shouldn't be or aren't appropriate to decide legally when he himself decided 2 out of 3. Now, I said it's written in Arabic, so it's a little hard to know exactly how to translate it. And if you tell me he changed his mind, at the end of his life, he cited all those sources and said that's his view. He cited the players of Mishnayos and the Mishnah Torah, and he said that's my view. So it's not likely that he changed his mind, not if he testifies to that. So probably what it means is something like it's not pressing to decide because nothing practical will come out of it. You know, what punishment God is going to give a person for the crime. But that it isn't decidable because it's only philosophical and not practical? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If the Rambam decided 2 out of 3, then he just got the facts wrong. This famous rabbi got the facts wrong. Yeah, finally. You want to say something? Oh, okay. So I think that when you hear these things, and Rabbi Meisman has a whole chapter on this in his book, so you can go through the sources there in detail if you need to do that. Yeah.
Should we base on something of maybe very time where you say we just pass them for the sake of knowing what to do, but really and truly both are correct in their entirety?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is a snippet of a much longer share, but I'll give you a little bit of it. There's a problem in citing Divrei Chazal, and this applies to people with black hats also. And here's what happens. The Talmud or the Midrash says something, and they decide to discuss it. As they're discussing it, they change the formulation. They make it shorter, clearer, sharper, and then they turn about talking about that. And then they come to their conclusions about that. Sometimes the conclusions are problematic. And they don't stop to realize you're not talking about the same subject. Well, I'm just saying the same thing shorter, quicker. Really? Why didn't Chazal say it shorter and quicker? Why didn't they say it clear and sharp like you did? Maybe because they didn't mean it. Now what you're quoting is Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. These and these are the words of the living God. And you're discussing, are they both true? That's much shorter, much clearer, much more precise. And they didn't say that. They didn't say they're both true. Correct, you said. Correct and true are the same in this context.
Based on the version.
No, you're not, because the Meforshim don't say it. The Meforshim do not say Elu ve'elu means that they're both true. They do not say that. On the contrary. Rabbi Tzvi Lampel has a book, I think we have a copy upstairs, called the Dynamics of Dispute, the Origins of Machlokes in Talmudic Times. He has a whole chapter on Elu ve'elu, and he has something like 11 different interpretations of Elu ve'elu, and aside from Kabbalistic sources, all of the legal sources do not say that they're both true. They do not say that. Just not correct. But you should stop and ask. Since these things are both true, it's shorter and clearer than these are words of the living God, which is poetry. So you have to wonder that it doesn't mean that. Now, Elu ve'elu, according to the Ritva, means that Kadosh Baruch Hu gave reasons for both sides of a machlokes. All the reasons come from a Kadosh Baruch Hu. All the reasons are genuine reasons. This is a genuine reason that it's kosher. It's a genuine reason that it's treif. That's all Elu ve'elu, and the psak was not. I'm not talking about the psak at all. Rashi in Ksubah says exactly the same thing, but not metaphysically. He says when you have a discussion about what the halacha is, all the reasons given by the Chachamim are genuine pieces of Torah. They all apply sometimes in various contexts correctly, and this now is that's the Elu ve'elu. Elu ve'elu is the reasons that are given, but not more than that. The Maharal says that it only applies to Hillel and Shammai, but he says like this: the world, the only achdus in the whole of existence is a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Everything else is complex. So with the machlokes, whether this is tamei or tahor, there is a tamei side to it. There is a tahor side to it, and each one is responding to a reality. This side sees tuma, and tuma is really there. And this side sees Tara, and Tara is really there. Now the psak should be based on the majority, not always balanced. In the case of Hillel and Shammai, they were balanced, and therefore whichever one you said would be justifiable as the halacha because it was equally balanced with the other one. But it doesn't say that the psak is equally true, that it's both tamei and tahor and so forth and so on. Is that either one is equally justified, not that they're both simultaneously true. Nobody says the two sides of a contradiction are true, and the pshat of those things. There are certain Kabbalistic sources which Rabbi Lampel brings at the end of the chapter, which say it's a mystery that we can't understand. Okay, that's fine. I don't mind if there are mysteries, but in halacha, in nigle, no one says it. Absolutely, no one says it. And I recommend this across the board. When you're talking about something, go back to the original words of Chazal and make sure that what you're talking about fits the original words. I have half a dozen examples of where people slide from what Chazal said to something else, and then they get in trouble. Anybody who says King David sinned is making a mistake. How could you say David didn't sin? Nosan the Navi comes to him. He's sitting on the throne. He says to him, "You're a sinner." He says, "I am a sinner." How could you say David didn't sin? It doesn't say David didn't sin. It says anybody who says he sinned is making a mistake. It's not the same words. It's longer. It's roundabout. Why bother saying it that way? Well, he didn't sin. Because they don't mean he didn't sin. They mean anybody who says he didn't sin is making a mistake. What's he making a mistake about? He's making a mistake about what the sin was, what its character was, what its implications are. He doesn't understand what happened. That's all. But yeah, and that happens over and over again. People take what Chazal say, and then they twist it into something else, and then they have trouble with something else. Well, you have to learn to stop twisting. Yeah, last question. I've got to go.
I've heard it said, actually recently by one of the Rabbi here, he was discussing how, when a person is making decisions on what to learn, how much to learn, or just for their whole life, making decisions on what to focus on in their life, they should look at, well, what are your goals? What are your sheefus, right? They expounded on the need for a person to have sheefus, and you base, your learning whatever to help you get towards whatever your sheefus are. My kind of question with that whole idea of sheefus is, shouldn't we be looking to where Hashem sends us to complete the mission He has in mind for us, and not setting ourselves arbitrary goals and then living our life, limiting our life based on those goals?
I can't answer the whole thing. So you're asking a whole life question. I've got 3 minutes. I have to go upstairs and teach. But I would say this: the appeal to your sheefus is very superficial. Maybe your sheefus are wrong. Maybe they're bad. Right? I mean, why should your goal, your hopes, and your dreams determine what you're doing? We had a guy here, maybe 20 years ago. He came to study Talmud because he heard that studying the Talmud makes you smart. And his goal was to be a millionaire by the age of 35. And for that, you got to be smart. So he said, I'm coming to learn Talmud. Don't talk to me about halacha. Saturdays, I'm going to be in Tel Aviv. Leave me alone. I'm not putting on tefillin. I'm not keeping kosher. I want to be smart and earn $1 million. And he told us this. And we said, fine. If you come to class, you're here 7 hours a day, do whatever you want. A whole year went by. He said, I don't think I'm smart enough yet. So he stayed. In the middle of the second year, he began to change. Then he began to change. Nobody said to him, but your sheefus for the $1 million. Don't forget the $1 million. You know, keep it up. Keep going for the $1 million. No. We started to keep kosher. He started to keep Shabbos. He started davening. You know, we congratulated him that he was growing up a little bit, becoming a little bit more mature. So I certainly wouldn't say that you base it on the person's own sheefus. I would ask him, the question is sheefus. Internally, at least, think of all the kinds of things that you're looking forward to and hoping for and see whether they're consistent. Sometimes there are deeper ones that you don't look at because they'll get in the way of the cheeseburgers, so yeah, you just sort of cover them up. But if they're really there, you're not going to be really satisfied. There's a lot to talk about there. Okay.